watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, doing a second show here. We had Jeremiah Bannister on doing his Monday morning show at RNT. The Paleocrat doing Paleocrat Diaries, talking about secular humanism. So go and watch it if you haven't already. For this show, we have returning guest and good friend of mine, Gary Michuta, on to talk about his book, Revolt Against Reality, which you can actually find a link to there in the description to this video. So if you just click on the show notes, click on that link, it'll take you to Catholic Answers that published this. All right. Well, Gary, welcome to the show. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Can't complain. How about you?
Doing very well. Really good to have you back on. It's been a little while.
Yeah. Well, it's always fun to rock and roll here on RNT. And
yeah.
I've actually been looking forward to this because you guys really go in depth in a lot of things. So I feel like I've got to defend my thesis here.
Defend your thesis. That's kind of what we did when we did the Canon show. And then I think after that, we had a couple debates with you and Steve Christie. I believe, and that may have been the last time you were on. Is that right?
No, I think I co-host. I was with William.
There's a round table or something. Yeah,
it was something like that. Yeah,
right. So, but I know it's been a while. So again, pleasure to have you back on. Well, let's dive into the book itself. Tell me first, just some, answer some basic questions. Maybe, why exactly did you write the book, and what exactly is it about?
Okay. Well, I wrote it because things be crazy, and
put it.
Things are crazy, and I thought, nowadays that I think lots of times we're dealing with ancillary issues where we really should be looking at the deep causes for the insanity we live in today, and so I decided I'm going to put together some stuff because I always knew that there were certain aspects of philosophy and other things that are in the mix of what we're experiencing today. So I basically, what I did was I back engineered the craziness. I started off with the stuff that's going today, looking at the immediate causes, and then kind of traced it back into history. They say when you write a murder mystery, you start off with a murder. And then once you figure that out, then you write the book, from beginning to end. So I kind of did that. And so the result is Revolt Against Reality, which took a little while to do. And but I think it's got really good explanatory power. And I think it has very good predictive power as well, because I finished the manuscript a couple of years ago. And some of the things I have in my last chapter that I point to has actually continued on and grown even bigger. So,
well, I actually recall you working on it a while back. How come you didn't publish it back then, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, I did. I signed with Catholic Answers Press, but what I didn't know was they had a lot of books in the queue, and so it took a long time between manuscript development and publication. And quite frankly, I mean, my original manuscript was so dense that Todd at Catholic Answers Press said, you got to cut this down to this minimum. And I did. I actually exceeded that. And then he, with the layout, he did a great job making the layout. So it really is a page turner. It's not as dense as my other books, although I cover a ton of territory in it.
Yeah, it's really well done, and kudos to Catholic Answers for the formatting as well. I love the way they laid it out here. Now, the first thing that you go over is creation and incarnation. So, revolt against reality in that context, going all the way back to Genesis. So, walk us through that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I started a little. I stopped a little later, but I decided, what? There's elements in the serpent's lie that runs throughout all the revolts, throughout human history. So started at the beginning with God, who is goodness itself, creates through his word, which is his wisdom. And so his created, what he creates reflects in a limited way his own wisdom. that God created things with certain essences or natures. So things have capacities to do certain things and not have capacities for other things, right? So a fruit-bearing tree bears fruit, doesn't bear orangutans, right? Because it doesn't have the capability. So there's a built-in directedness in creation, teleology. I talk about secondary causation, all that good stuff, because at the beginning, God creates and reality is, right? So you have this unity between what God is, what he wills, and how things truly are. Then, of course, the serpent comes, and it's really interesting if you look at the lie of the serpent, because really what he does is he introduces the first act of insanity. If you hold on to the correspondence view of truth, that what truth is when what is known corresponds to what is,
right?
Then what he does is kind of detaches that, and he tells Eve that God isn't saying don't eat of the fruit for your own good, right? He's holding out on you. He's actually holding you back. God knows that if you eat this fruit, that your eyes will be open and you'll know good and evil. And I think in that context, it's like determine for yourself what's good and evil. Kind of like he tries to give a backstage secret message, secret knowledge about God, that really what's going on is God creates good and evil how he wants, and he knows if you'll do this, then you'll be like him. So there's lots of layers of deceit within that, but you have this idea of divine deception, you have this idea of secret knowledge, and what I do, and you can see traces of that, as throughout history, right? With the Gnostics, with secret knowledge, divine deception pops up here and there. But anyway, so yeah, I have that, and then they sin, and I have the fall, and we fall like a stone. And I think this story really picks up with the Deuterocanon, right? With the Hasmonean period. Because Michael, something really cool happens during this period. This is where the Jews are confronted with Greek philosophical thought.
Right.
And what happens is it actually kind of lights up like Christmas tree lights. I mean, it's not perfect. The Greek philosophy has lots of errors. But nevertheless, there is a kind of coherence between reason and revelation, or you could say reason and theology. So
right,
fit that in, right? So
Yeah.
it's like, so you have the Book of Wisdom, you have Sirach, you have these books that kind of unpack revelation using reason, and you have ideas about the Word being apart from God, yet God Himself, which really lays the groundwork for John 1:1 with the Incarnation, and ultimately. The Incarnation is the fundamental moment in human history. It's the great unifying moment where God and man are joined. The invisible God becomes visible, material and spiritual. The infinite and the finite all of this is united. We are all united in Christ, and by being united in Christ, we're radically united to each other. So that huge unifying moment of the Incarnation is like where God establishes a beachhead of sanity, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, piggybacking off of that, it seems like Athanasius makes that connection as well, because he sees the Incarnation as this really supreme moment of redemption. I mean, as former, well, at least speaking for myself as a former evangelical, the emphasis is often on the cross, and of course, there's a whole lot of truth to the cross being salvific. Don't get me wrong, but often some people tend to overlook the importance in the Incarnation when it comes to the role of redemption and salvation, and Athanasius tends to bring that out. So kind of piggybacking off of what you were saying there.
Yeah, absolutely. Christ takes on all things into himself and offers it to the Father. Yeah, so that the blinding light of the Incarnation is amazing. It's something that I include in my book, because what happens is it sparks off all these revolutions of thought in human thought, right? Where suddenly we now have a realistic view of nature, and so you have revolutions of thought with science. You have revolutions of thought about human integrity and value. In Roman society, for example, women and children were essentially property. They weren't people. The Incarnation changes that. It changes the nature of the church as the body of Christ. It changes how we unite as communities, how we ought to be governed. All these radical revolutions ultimately stage the coming of Western civilization. And so I include all these positive revelations that are sparked off from the Incarnation. And then there's the flip side of, I think, where humans begin to shrink back from the blinding light of the Incarnation.
Huh.
And that's where, Christological heresies develop.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's kind of the root of the craziness today. It actually goes way back then.
Why do you think that we do that? Why do you think that humanity tends to shrink back from this blinding light of revelation in Christ when it comes into the world?
Yeah. That's almost like a mystery of iniquity.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, it's hard to tell. I don't think there really is an answer. It's like, why did a third of the angels fall?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's because we have free will. And, even when we have clear insight into what's good and right, beautiful and just, some turn their will against that and some don't.
It seems like that's a manifestation of insanity.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if we aren't given the truth, we're exposed to the truth, and we shrink back from it and reject it. It seems like that's going against reality.
Yeah.
And that is the most insane thing that you could do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, so what I do is, both ends of the Incarnation, there's denial of Christ's true humanity, denial of his true divinity. And it kind of starts from there, So I briefly trace those causes. And ultimately, I come to Islam. And this is really interesting. I learned a lot from a book by Robert Riley called The Closing of the Muslim Mind. Highly recommend people read that book. Because what happened to Judaism, when it encountered Greek philosophy, it kind of lit up. There was a coherence between the two. When Islam encounters Greek philosophy and Aristotle, it's like a train wreck. Because Islamic revelation didn't really cohere with the rationality of the people like Aristotle. And so within Islam, you have these two kind of reactions to the rediscovery of Aristotle. And for simplification, I just call it the rational party and the irrational party. And the rational party, they basically said that, reason is good. And Allah is good, and we can know things about Allah through nature. That we can understand first things apart from revelation, and in a sense, they almost put philosophy above revelation, right? That you ultimately go with reason instead of revelation. And when revelation, I mean chronic revelation.
Yeah.
And so they actually sound very much more Christian than modern Muslims would. But the irrational party argue that that Allah doesn't necessarily will in accordance with his nature. Allah could, in a sense, they thought that Allah's will was being constrained by his nature. And so since Allah does all things under compulsion, and basically Allah can will something good, and then he could will it evil. And he can give revelation, and he could abrogate revelation. And so the idea, by separating the nature of God from his will, that has devastating effects on all sorts of fields, right? Because if you follow that to its logical or illogical conclusion, you have things like God can change his mind. You have secondary causality disappears in Islam, or at least some aspects of thought in Islam. There's a great verse a passage that William Riley quotes where he says, he quotes a Muslim scientist who says it's un-Islamic to say if you combine hydrogen and oxygen, you get water. He says it is Islamic to say if you combine hydrogen and oxygen by Allah's will, it becomes water. In other words, Allah could will that it becomes a unicorn, right? Or a lump of coal, So there's no inherent secondary causes in nature. Everything is the direct will of Allah, right? Which shows why science kind of becomes stillborn within Islam. There's great discoveries and great minds, but it just doesn't take off on that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Pope Benedict XVI have an address about this concerning Islam that was a little controversial a while back? I think was it the Regensburg address? I forget.
Yeah,
wasn't that what this is about?
Yeah, kind of. And Riley argues in his book that that's why Islamic countries are at the bottom of human development. Markers of human development.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and also within Islam too, the Rational Party wants to separate reason and revelation so that the philosopher kings, they can access first principles, where revelation is more for the people, for the plebs, right? The uneducated. And that plays a big role later on as well. And you see that with Averroes, for example. Although it's not quite as strict as that, it's within that form. And
it seems like this issue also with God's will and some of the problems that result from this when you tease it out philosophically. It seemed like that also infected the West to some degree. Those there were some who thought that that whole debate between is something good because God wills it, or does God will it because it's good? There's that whole debate, and some would take somewhat of an unorthodox perspective here on God's will, and it would lead to all kinds of problems. Sounds like that also infected the West, I should say.
Yeah. You know what? That's because you're so astute, Michael. That's exactly what I trace in my book. Because right around this time, you start having the decline of the Western Roman Empire and ancestral papism. The church now becomes involved in temporal affairs. And there's this conflict that happens under Ludwig of Bavaria. And Ludwig was elected in a controversial election to be the emperor. And this was during a interregnum period. And Pope John the 23rd was elected. And he and another claimant, the Pope said, basically, both of you, I want you to lay down your titles and we'll start over again. And of course, they ignore the Pope. They battle against each other. Ludwig wins. And so there's this kind of war that erupts between Ludwig of Bavaria and the Pope in regards to a kind of a fight for the death, because the Pope excommunicates Ludwig. And one of the things Ludwig does, he not only fights with armed forces against the papacy, but he has this intellectual scorched earth policy where he welcomes and he funds certain intellectual thinkers, one of which is Marsilius of Padua, who wrote a book on, now I'm forgetting the name, but it's on a piece of the church. I can't remember the name now. But anywhere where he posits that that the government essentially operates on a rational level, and religion is just there to confirm what the government already has by pure rational alone. So he elevates like the averist, reason over faith. And then William of Ockham. This is a really cool story if people aren't familiar with it, but William of Ockham was in hot water. He was called to Avignon to be tried by the Pope. And while there, he meets the poor Franciscans. Poor Franciscans believed that only total poverty was in line with the gospel. And so they asked William of Ockham if he could argue their case before the Pope. And what William does is he adapts some of this Islamic thought And he basically argues that God is not constrained by his nature, that God can will things and he can change his mind. So, because one of the main arguments the church had for property was, well, property is a good. In the Old Testament, it's legislated, right? God likes it. And so he argued, well, yeah, God could call it good in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, he could call it evil. And before he gets the sentences given, he flees to Ludwig of Bavaria, and his ideas circulate. And so that same thing of God detaching God's will from his nature in Islam is kind of imported into Christianity, into Europe.
Yeah, and I could see how that would lead to a lot of insane problems.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah.
so tell me about a little bit more when it comes to some of these ecclesiological revolts that you discuss here in the book. I see, of course, the Protestant Reformation is one of them. Maybe before we talk about the Reformation itself, are there any pre-Reformation revolts that we could address before we then dive into Luther and all that stuff?
Well, yeah, that same Occam's idea becomes nominalism, that you deny universals, things that unify things as concepts like triangularity or greenness or redness. And all you have is individual things. And what unites them is just names we put on things, right? And that also has this idea of separating God's nature from his will. The anomalist said that, it might have been even Occam, that God could have crucified a donkey and it would have sufficed to redeem the world, because all God has to do is declare it to be sufficient, right? Even though it isn't.
Yeah, if there really isn't a shared nature among us, and these are just titles and names, then the incarnation is useless. So is the resurrection, for that matter, because in the incarnation, Christ takes on human flesh and takes on humanity and heals it. If we're not all human, if we don't share the same nature, and this is just some kind of title for things that are actually different, then he didn't actually touch humanity. He didn't actually redeem me specifically as a human, because there is no such thing as humanity. I mean, wouldn't that be one of the problems?
Oh, it's huge.
Come from nominalism, you would think, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and this becomes the modern way. This becomes the majority view in faculties. You have the Via Moderna, the modern way, versus the Via Antiqua that follows Aquinas. And so modernism wasn't like a 19th century thing. This is like the old time modernism.
Yeah.
And and what happens is Luther was soaked in nominalism. Now he didn't. There are some things that he disagreed with among the nominalists, because some of them were actually kind of Pelagian. But if you just transfer those ideas into theology, Michael, you see it's like pure nominalism, especially the idea of justification as an imputation, that God calls us righteous, even though by nature we're still unrighteous. And once that enters into theology in my book, I just unpack all the different things, the splits that occur that used to be unified in Christian thought gets put into dichotomies, especially with Luther, faith and works, grace and human effort, things like that. And ultimately, just like in Islam, if God's will is separated from his nature, the only way to know Allah's will is through revelation alone, right? So it becomes religion of the book. In Protestantism, you have sola scriptura, right? Because the only way you really know God's will is through what he reveals and nothing else, right? So you have that, and you also have this idea of faith becoming reflexive with Luther, that before, the church always conceived of faith as where we join ourselves as individuals with that vision of Christ's bride viewing Christ himself, right? It's all this single vision that we all participate in. But with Luther, faith becomes bent back to the believer, so that it's not necessarily believing in what Christ did, right? He would say that's just purely like a historical faith. But what in Christ does for me, that's what's operative. It's only when faith is bent back to the believer that actually becomes efficacious. And so this has all sorts of ramifications that I have in my book, and I show that, ultimately it leads to things like Ludwig Feuerbach, his idea that God is nothing more than a projection of our self wants and needs. That's because of this, anthropomorphic or anthropocentric idea of faith being bent back on the believer. So within this, all the future problems that we run into, it's like Luther tries to fix a problem that he saw, and by doing that, he just creates another problem that has to be solved, and that creates another, and so on and so forth.
Just added more problems on top of it. Yeah. Seems like he really was just trying to deal with some personal problems that he was having when it comes to scrupulosity and the theological perspective that he concluded was, especially on justification, was just there to kind of alleviate the problems he was experiencing. But with that solution, and it wasn't a good one, but in his mind it was a solution, then came many, many, many other problems. So.
Yeah, like the historic church. What do you do with the historic church? So from Luther, we have the Centuriators, the beginning of no popery history. So it's like a fake history or fake news in the Middle Ages. You have where he has to reimagine apostolicity, and ultimately the church starts becoming spiritualized. And you especially see this with other reformers like Zwingli and Calvin, where you start having this anti-incarnational aspect to it, where the church is stripped of her materiality, right? So it becomes more of a invisible collection of the elect. Calvin gets rid of sacred time and sacred space. And you also start having Eucharistic controversies. I mean, right off the bat, you have Luther with Zwingli disagreeing at Magdeburg Colloquy over whether or not Christ is really present in the Eucharist. And so I have some interesting quotes from that as well.
Which I've always just found interesting, just because if sola scriptura were true, then the very important doctrines, such as the Eucharist, you would think would be clear enough for astute people like Luther and Calvin and Zwingli. I'm not saying scripture, according to a Protestant, has to be absolutely clear on everything, but at least on the fundamentals. And of course, we would say the Eucharist would be one of the fundamentals. So I always just found that odd that those that would maintain sola scriptura would debate this issue, but then believe that all of the fundamentals are sufficiently clear in sacred scripture.
Yeah, you think, yeah. And, 48 years later, in 1577, you have a book by Christoph Rasberger, who compiled 200 different interpretations of the words, "This is my body."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Protestantism really begins to splinter. And I think at the root, and I actually got this from a Lutheran book, it's called The Churches Luther Left Behind, that there are two basic principles that Luther established that's part of Protestant identity. And that is the righteous warrior, or the righteous rebel, I should say, and doctrinal purity. Okay, so the righteous rebel is, with the words that were supposedly said at the Diet of Worms, "Here I stand, I could do no other." The idea that if your cause is just, that you can stand up against anybody, including the historic church, and stand your ground on the basis of conscience. And then the other aspect's doctrinal purity, where you can do that if you believe that the doctrine wasn't pure. So Luther rejected the historic church for doctrinal purity on justification by faith alone, and so on. And immediately what happens is those same two principles just rip apart the Protestant revolt, because now another righteous rebel could say to Dr. Luther, your doctrine isn't completely pure. So I, as a righteous rebel, can separate from you.
Semper reformanda.
Yeah, and it just keeps splintering and splintering. And, Michael, and, I don't want to give the impression that I'm trying to argue that nominalism is the cause of everything that's wrong. There's so many other components. In my book, I flush this out. But, at this point, you have the state church, right, where church and state are fairly united together. So as Protestantism splits and splinters, what you start having is this fracturing that occurs in the empire. And so you have the beginning of religious wars. And it seems like religion is reduced down to just a set of propositions because these wars are over different doctrinal propositions and so on. And this sets the stage for what I call, it's really man's endeavor to unify humanity on something other than the incarnation, right? So now we start finding attempts during the Enlightenment period where people are trying to figure out how can we unite everybody without the unpleasant aftertaste of Catholicism, right? And so go ahead. You're going to say something.
Well, this then brings us to some epistemological concerns, right? And that's kind of the next thing you address. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, you have deism. Now, I think most people don't think of deism as an attempt to unify humanity, but that's exactly what it is. It assumes religion is nothing but propositions. And so if you can just come up with enough common propositions that everybody can sign on, then not only all Christians would be united, but all religions would be united. And the problem is that those propositions go smaller and smaller, and eventually, you have something like the God of philosophy, but at that point, it really makes no difference whether God wound up the universe and sent it out, or there is no God, right? So you have atheism kind of lurking behind the scenes. Or you have another aspect too, a kind of liberalism, where if we just make doctrines fuzzy enough, then people can kind of sign on to these fuzzy doctrines. And basically that just, makes for an even bigger mess. And so, and then there's other aspects trying to unite, like with the Dutch, for example, with consumerism, right? That maybe we could all unite under the fact that we can get goods and services. And, maybe we can't be united on belief, but we could be united in that we all want nice silverware or something like that, or tea or coffee or something like, which, then that ushers in consumerism that we experience today. And there's all sorts of odd things. Like, for example, I found this in Greg Keener. Actually, I have his 2-volume set behind me on his work on miracles. And he points out that with Luther and Brewster and some other Protestant reformers, Catholics were arguing that, look, the historic church has had miracles in every age, right? And so you Protestants don't have miracles. We have miracles. How can you break from us? And the reaction was that miracles only happened in the New Testament period and maybe in the early church. But after that, the period of miracles stopped, okay? And they're very, very rare. And so this cessationism from miracles also plays into deism, because if you remember Hume's critique of miracles, one aspect of it is that miracles don't happen because they're incredibly rare, right? Because that's basically their position. Or it happened in an age so distant that we don't have direct testimony. So it's more rational to believe that miracles don't exist. That's taken, basically built upon this reaction to Catholicism. So, so you got all these currents. And then eventually, I focus then on Locke, John Locke, who decides he's going to make a separation between secular powers and religious powers, right? And the problem is, with Locke is he doesn't realize that there is no hard iron wall that separates the two spheres. He says that the secular civil interest involved, this is a quote from him, I call life, liberty, health, and indulgency of the body, and possession of outward things. like money, lands, houses, furniture, and the like. But, if you think about that, all of those things can only properly be known through reason and theology, right? I mean, life. When does life begin? When does life end? Can you take somebody's life under what circumstances, right? I mean, the same thing we're embroiled today, right? Those are religious philosophical questions. Those aren't secular questions. And even property, proper use of money. Are you entitled to own property? So what it tries to do is it tries to make a kind of safe zone for you religious who want to do their interior beliefs, these propositions. You can play in this area over here, but, leave that out of all the real world stuff, over here in the secular sphere. And really what that was a usurpation of really what before was a unified vision of both temporal and spiritual is now like torn apart. So you have the temporal apart from the spiritual. So any thoughts on that?
Well, much can be said there, and I'm curious that you brought up Hume there. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on him? Because I think that a lot of the problems in the modern era go back to Hume and then Kant, and to a degree.
Yeah.
Do you go over those in any more detail?
No, I can't, because I have to have all of human history within 30,000 or 30 words. Unfortunately, I can only hit the
highlights.
But what's interests me is that you can see how the stages were set through these revolts against the Incarnation until when Hume comes on the scene. His argumentation seems probable, very possible. Where today, actually, the stuffing has been knocked out of Hume's philosophy. And I think he's been thoroughly refuted. But nevertheless, at that point in time with these revolts and how religion has been reconceived as something that's purely interior, belief in propositions, and it's reduced down to only, this small sphere of life, that Hume could step in and say, well, who needs God? Basically, you don't need miracles. You can come up with a rational aspect, and also you can even see even in Hume where he downplays causation,
That's another one, because that really undermines a lot of the proofs for God, because a lot of the proofs that Aquinas and even going back to Aristotle that they used for God depend on this idea of causality.
Absolutely.
So to undermine that, you're then undermining this idea that we can say we can know that there is a God by natural revelation, by human reason.
And for him, cause and effect are loose and separable, kind of, they just appear to be happening, but there isn't any strict thing that we would call causation going on. And again, back, rewinding the tape to Islam and Occam, they kind of opened the door for that, because this nominalistic understanding of God ultimately kind of detracts from secondary causation. So it sets, Hume is a product of his age in a way.
Now, the last part that you go over is going to be sociological revolts. So maybe talk to me a little bit about those. And everybody there in the chat, go ahead and start sending some chat questions. Make sure to send them to @ReasonAndTheology. If you don't put that in there, I probably won't realize that it's a question, because I think it's just part of the comments that y'all have there in the chat. So again, send it to @ReasonAndTheology, and we'll get to those shortly.
Okay. Social revolt. Religion becomes just an idea. And I trace this through conversionism in the 1820s and here in America, where has to do with the Calvinist question, how do I know I'm elect? And ultimately the conversionists have that if you have, this regeneration, this experience of regeneration, that is a sign that you're born again. And so you have the second great awakening, and that spawns all sorts of new thoughts, many of them bad, some of them noble but wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I could go on and on, but, ultimately conversionism starts becoming reductionistic. So it almost becomes like salvation by a formula,
Mm.
where I have Charles Finney, who says that equated regeneration to a change in the disposition of the mind, which sounds a lot like Gnosticism, right? And, in my book, I show how you can see how these same threads of thought continue on. So anyway, boy, where to go?
Wow, and that's a complete denial of the historical view of Christianity, which says that regeneration is at the moment of baptism. It's not necessarily. It includes a turning away from sin. It includes a change in disposition of the mind. All that's included. But fundamentally and objectively, it is the sacrament of baptism that regenerates one. Yeah.
Yeah. So, which is very different from classic Protestant Calvinism, Luther.
Yeah.
It's all attached to proper use of the sacraments and preaching.
Yeah.
Right? So there's exterior aspect to it.
That the modern view of altar calls, I believe, goes back to Finney. Is that not right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, also, what happens is Finney's able to say, so you have saved people in the Baptist camp, you have saved people in Methodist camp, even Catholics can be saved as long as they have this experience, right?
That reminds me of George Whitefield too.
Yeah.
He said the exact same thing. He had a sermon where he was talking about, in heaven, God doesn't say, nobody is saying I'm an Episcopalian, I'm a Methodist, I'm a blah, 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 blah. There's just one who's everybody is one in Christ. But the context of him saying all of that was to say that, here on earth, you shouldn't worry about whether you're a Methodist or Episcopalian or Presbyterian. As long as you have this conversion experience, you're good to go.
Yeah. And that brings about non-denominationalism, that sweeps, and then non-denominationalism morphs into the megachurch movement. And megachurch movement morphs into what I believe is the category of the non-affiliated. There's a lot of atheists that fall in that category, but I think it's also a lot of people who have just take this to its own logical conclusion that it doesn't matter what religion, what creed, what exterior thing. It's what matters is what I am doing spiritually. So religion becomes a kind of do-it-yourself proposition. So you come up with I always get this wrong. Moral therapeutic deism. Is that right? I know I'm messing those up. Yeah.
This one's a new one for me.
I forgot what the name
this
of
one before. Okay.
Yeah, it's moralistic therapeutic deism.
Okay.
That was defined by Christian Smith when he was studying this belief in spiritual but not religious. And basically God's out there. He wants you to be good, and he's also there for you to help you. So it's therapeutic. You can improve yourself. And I've seen your comedy bits on RT. And, that is essentially moralistic therapeutic deism. I mean, it's like God is here to make you wealthy, or God is here to, he wants you to have a new car and house.
Yeah, the word faith movement, prosperity movement, all that. Yeah. Wow.
So anyway, I take it into the Revolt Against Reality in chapter 13, and I focus on Catholicism specific. I mean, I do throughout the book, and I have the good and the bad. But I take a really different approach on Vatican II that I haven't seen out there.
What's that approach?
Yeah. So I believe that Vatican II unwittingly destroyed Protestant identity.
How so?
Because remember those two pillars of Protestant identity, the righteous rebel and the quest for doctrinal purity? Well, all this time to be Protestant was to be anti-Catholic, to be against the Pope. We used to joke for years as apologists saying the one doctrine that unites all of Protestantism is their opposition to the papacy or opposition to Catholicism. Then Vatican II comes on the scene, right? And Paul VI is not an imperial pope. And Vatican II is not one of those anathematizing councils, right? They're talking about humanism. They're reaching out, and suddenly, I think Protestantism is a righteous rebel without a cause. That the great enemy has now disappeared. And what I think happens, and I argue this in my book, is that Protestants begin to search for a new identity. They still want to be righteous rebels, but what about doctrinal purity? Doctrinal purity turns into social purity. Okay. So in a sense, this Protestant identity is transferred to the secular sphere in the 60s. So instead of saying I'm Methodist, I'm Baptist, people are saying I am against the war, or I'm for women's liberation. And I think that starts doing what happens in the secular culture is what was happening in the religious culture up to this point. That secular culture starts becoming divided, right? And we could talk. I mean, the spirit of Vatican II, same thing. I go into that. It kind of has a nominalistic flavor to it, because the spirit of Vatican II is, how do you know what Vatican II taught? Well, you know through the experts, right? And so the experts kind of have this intermediary between us and the church, which you find in nominalism. Because how do you know God's revelation? Well, through God's will, you know it through revelation. How do you know his revelation? Well, in Islam, it's through clerics, right? In Protestantism, it's through ministers. In later liberal Protestantism, it is through the experts, German experts, higher criticism. And so you have this revolution within the Catholic University that takes place also in the 60s. And what happens is there's these experts that will tell you what the truth about Vatican II is. And surprise, surprise, the truth about Vatican II is also kind of anti-incarnational, anti-sacramental. So, painting statues, the spirit kind of doesn't want things like that. The things that exhibit the sacramentality of Christ and the church. So
now, before we get to the chat questions, I don't know if you want to go over this. Instead of me saying what the conclusion is, I'm gonna just ask you: do you want to maybe tell us what exactly you conclude at the end of the book, or would that be too much of a spoiler?
Okay, yeah, okay. Spoiler alert. Yeah, the conclusion is we're in bad shape. I finished when I finished chapter 13. It was so bleak and so dark. I thought, I can't leave the book like this, right? Because so I added another chapter called Reality Strikes Back. In this chapter, I look for signs of reality kind of pushing back from all these inroads, sexual revolution type stuff, and look for glimmers of hope, because ultimately we can neglect reality. We could sweep it aside, sweep it under the rug, but ultimately reality is the only thing that's real. There's no alternative, right? So, I mean, I think the final message is it should be a message of hope that we're on the right side, because there is no other game in town outside of reality. But anyway, so I ended there. And I don't give a solution, because the whole idea of the book was to get to the deep causes of the stuff today. And what I wanted to do was have this book start a dialogue among Catholics and other people as well, where we can start, figuring out a way that we can bring back, this incarnational revolution that happened in the first century with Christ.
When I read that there at the end, I thought, well, that fair enough, because I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, okay, well, what exactly is the solution? And you just come out very frankly and say, I'm not proposing a solution necessarily. I'm just saying this is how we've gotten to where we are. And if we're going to come up with a solution, the only way we can do that is if we know the history and can make sense of how we've gotten here. Is that right? Did I?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's absolutely it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought, wow, that's a really good point. I mean, how can we really offer a solution when we don't really know how we've gotten into this mess?
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I thought that was really well done.
Thank you.
There's quite a few questions here. Let's get to a few of them. This one is from Kyle. Not sure if this is related, but how do you approach the view that atheism is just a denial of God or gods and not a belief that no such being or beings exist?
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that's purely an apologetic question. I've gone back and forth with atheists on this. It's like it always goes in a circle that they'll insist that, no, I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic. But if you push them on it, then they end up being atheistic. If God doesn't exist, why are they even talking about it? It's impossible to talk about something that doesn't exist because it doesn't exist, right? So I think the very fact that they deny God ultimately shows that there is a belief that God could exist. And so it's ultimately a denial of the God that could exist. And I feel from my reading of atheistic literature, and I'm not well read in it, so forgive me if I'm off on the point, but I think they realize that and they feel they're conceding too much to the theist. And that's why they like to shrink back to an agnostic approach. Like, I'm just saying we don't know.
This one is from Billy. Gary, what did you enjoy most about writing the book? What is different? Was it different than other books that you've written?
Oh, yeah, it's hugely different. This is a genre that hasn't been touched. Actually, it's the person I know who did this was Sir Arnold Lunn, a great British apologist, in his Revolt Against Reason. Was it Flight from Reason and Revolt Against Reason, where it's like a mega apology where he gives the big picture. It was fun because I write books to organize my thoughts, and these things have been circulating in my head for years. And what was really cool, and it's still happening today, because as I'm rereading the text, I'm noticing all these connections that I probably could have brought out, where one thing kind of opens the door for another stream of thought. So it's been a lot of fun, and I've been enjoying the interviews. I talked to a lot of super smart people like Michael, and just the insights and things into the problem. It's very hopeful, because I know, I can't come up with a solution, but I know that a lot of brighter people than I can. So,
I kind of wonder if the solution lies in a return to realism, especially as you find in Aquinas. At least, I'm not saying that's going to be the ultimate solution, but it seems like a lot of these problems go back to that debate. So a return to more of a realistic metaphysics would end up healing some of these problems. Not saying everything. But
I think what we're experiencing is a systemic failure of civilization. I mean, it's like everything is collapsing. And the reason for that, I argue in my book, is because of this Catholic cultural momentum, that we don't realize those revolutions of thought that were started by the Incarnation has carried us, so that, we can say, oh, we could get rid of this, and look, the sky didn't fall, and we could get rid of this, and marriage can be, we can allow divorce and remarriage, and look, civilization's continuing fine. And as time continues, that momentum wanes. And I think today we're at the point where that momentum is waned to the point where it's like everything is falling, at a meteoric speed. And so, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Michael. It's return to this realism and Aquinas, and this idea of natures and essences and teleology, and some of that's coming back, like in my last chapter.
I've seen.
But there's a lot of other things too. We got to restart cultural momentum. And we have a lot of other things we have to address too. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's helpful. And I think that, another thing to kind of couple it, and correct me if I'm wrong, or just let me know your thoughts here, but it seems that people nowadays are seeing the bankruptcy of a materialistic world. I mean, there are some benefits, obviously, to the way society is right now with its focus on the material world, such as advances in technology. But obviously, people are saying that it's ultimately bankrupt. And so one thing that I've personally found helpful, and I wonder if others would as well, is a return to the spirituality that you especially see in the Desert Fathers. And some might think, well, that's kind of random. Why would that be a solution? Well, what the Desert Fathers tend to do is they try to separate oneself from this world. I mean, obviously, you can't do so entirely, especially if you're living a married vocation or something like that. But one tries to, insofar as it's possible, stop focusing on the things of this world and focus on God and a relationship with Him. And from that comes a peace and happiness that you just can't experience whenever you're just so engaged in the world. So I wonder if not only a return to a realistic metaphysics, but also a return to more of the spirituality that we see among the Desert Fathers. I wonder if that would also really go a long way in fixing the insanity that we see today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one thing I noticed that we end up in these silos, right? Echo chambers that use confirmation bias.
Hmm.
And I mean, I think the first thing we need to do is unplug.
Yeah.
And have a much more contemplative view rather than searching out channels on social media that just confirm our bias.
There's definitely that.
Yeah.
And somebody was asking there in the chat in that last question, was this different from your other books? I have to say, I reviewed your other book, the book on the canon, not long ago for I forget what it's not magazine, but for some periodical recently. And so I reviewed the canon book. And by the way, I gave it a really good review.
Yay,
I think I
thanks.
told you about it.
Yeah, that's right.
But it reads very differently than this, which is not a bad thing. It just goes to show you're very diverse when it comes to you as an author. It reads very differently than how you did the canon book. So, I mean, kudos to you. It just really shows a great deal of diversity.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's totally different from my other, but it's the same DNA, because I think there's very important issues. Like you'll see a little deuterocanonical stuff in this one.
Sure.
You'll see hostile witness stuff in this one. But yeah, well, thank you. Then I achieved my goal, Michael, because I wanted it to be something you could sit down and read through, and it's not super dense like a lot of my other works.
Yeah, it's very well done. This one is from Topper009. Do we know with certainty that Aristotelian final causality is the true? The natural law is dogma. Does or seems like much of the revolt against reality is some denial of the natural law? What would you say here?
Yeah, well, I don't think you even have to answer those questions. I think, I think you can maybe not have a rigid view of like Aristotelian, final causality, efficient causality, but you do need to have a connection between the creator and the created, and that there's this analogy that goes on between the two, and that we can know the creator through the created, which is a very soft version of natural theology, natural law. Yeah, I don't know. The particulars, I'll leave it to the experts to hammer out, but I think, but the worst thing is to separate those, because once you separate the two, then nature just becomes whatever we want to make it. And we become nominalistic gods. Like a man can declare himself to be a woman, right? And in his eyes, he really is a woman because he says he is, or an animal or something like that.
Yeah, talk about revolt against reality. I mean,
I go into that too in this book as well a little bit.
Yeah, that to me seems like the most extreme example of how our society has become frankly insane in some ways. It's incredible to believe that we live in a day and age where that's not seen as problematic. Well, this one is from Jate. How do I answer people through reason alone who support divorce, since here in the Philippines the law for divorce maybe will be implemented? Little off topic, but if you want to take a stab at it.
Yeah. Let's see. Explaining divorce, well, from reason alone, I think ultimately you could probably make a case just for the goods of marriage. That that a good, stable man and woman lifelong commitment is good for children, And the state has a vested interest in promoting that because that involves the generation of natives, native citizens. And native citizens are better than citizens that have, are from foreign lands that maybe haven't grown up in the culture and part of the culture from birth. Not to say they're bad citizens or anything like that, but I think the state has a vested interest in that. And to allow divorce, in my book, I trace the family and marriage and how no-fault divorce and how the state controlling marriage, all of that stuff has just spelled disaster. And that's another thing I think you could appeal to is the consequences that have resulted in liberal laws where, you have no-fault divorce that generates all sorts of problems. Still today, we have kids that grow up that don't get married precisely because their parents have been divorced, and which is a whole different problem. I guess I'd probably just park it there. I'm sure there's some great resources out there that can help you.
Gary, I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about your book. This was extremely helpful and enlightening. I already, put in a plug for where people can go to get a copy of the book, but anything else that you want to put in a plug for, go ahead. Let us know about it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, while I'm at it, William Albrecht, co-host with RT. We have a channel we do together called the Apocrypha Apocalypse on YouTube. So for any nerds that want to go really deep into that issue, talk about a micro niche, it's a micro niche. Please check it out, subscribe, like that type of stuff. And also I have my show Hands on Apologetics that's on Virgin Most Powerful Radio, that weekly show as well.
Yeah. And you get some really good guests on there.
People like William Albrecht, Eric Ibarra, Elijah Yassi, and a certain Michael Lofton that occasionally shows up.
Indeed,
Only the best of the best.
Appreciate that too. So once again, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. As you know, you're always welcome. Anything you ever want to talk about, you more than welcome to come on here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And hey, I'm an email away, Michael. So just shoot me an email. I'll be there.
You got it.
All right.
Everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support what we're doing here. All right, let's go do it. Till next time. God bless.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life